Jacob Mercer stood beneath the flicker of a dying fluorescent bulb in the Rattlesnake Creek feed store, his last $8 bill pressed flat between his thumb and the scarred wooden counter. The clerk didn't look up. Outside, the Nevada desert was swallowing the sun whole, painting the sagebrush hills in shades of rust and farewell. Jacob's hands, calloused, rope-burned, permanently stained with the copper dust of this unforgiving country, trembled slightly as he counted the crumpled singles one more time. $8. The sum total of what remained between him and the kind of hunger that makes a man consider things he swore he'd never do. He bought a bag of oats. Not for himself. For the borrowed horses on the property where he parked his converted trailer, the ones he fed in exchange for a place to sleep. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Alvarez, never asked for it, but Jacob couldn't take charity without giving something back. That was the mathematics of his dignity, the last equation he understood. The wedding band had left a pale groove on his ring finger, a ghost of gold he'd sold 9 months ago. His ex-wife, Caroline, had kept the house, the truck, and primary custody of their daughter Sophie. He'd kept his shame and a duffel bag of clothes that smelled like the hay he'd been hauling when everything fell apart. The accident replayed in his mind during the hours when sleep wouldn't come. The prize stallion spooked by thunder, the fence splintering like kindling, the animal's leg buckling at an angle that made Jacob's stomach turn 3 years later. His boss had needed someone to blame. Jacob, the new foreman, had been convenient. The truth, faulty lumber, deferred maintenance, a storm that came early, didn't matter. He'd signed the termination papers without fighting, and the word had spread through ranching country like wildfire. Unreliable, liability, finished. Now he lived in a horse trailer on land that wasn't his, doing day work that paid cash and bought silence. He mucked stalls, mended fence, broke ice from water troughs in the blue hours before dawn. He didn't complain. Men who've lost everything learn to carry their burdens quietly, the way you'd carry a wounded animal, carefully so the bleeding doesn't show. His daughter's voicemail message hadn't changed in 3 weeks. He'd called every Sunday listening to her 12-year-old voice recite the scripted greeting, but she never called back. Caroline said Sophie needed space, needed stability, needed things Jacob couldn't provide from a borrowed patch of desert with no address. He understood. Understanding didn't make the silence hurt less. The feed store clerk finally glanced up, counted the bills with practiced disinterest, and slid the oat bag across the counter. Jacob hoisted it onto his shoulder, felt the familiar ache in his lower back, and turned toward the door. That's when he saw it, a sun-faded flyer taped to the glass, curling at the edges like something trying to escape its own message. Bill Mustang auction, tomorrow, last chance before slaughter. The photograph was poor quality, photocopied too many times, but Jacob's eyes caught on one image among the dozen desperate faces. A buckskin mare, head turned sharply away from the camera as if refusing to be seen. Her ribs showed through dull hide. Her eyes, what little he could see of them, held something Jacob recognized. Not defeat. Fury. The specific rage of a creature that's been broken by circumstances beyond its control but hasn't yet surrendered the right to be angry about it. He shouldn't look twice. He could barely feed himself. The oat bag on his shoulder was proof of his own precarious gravity, the constant pull toward rock bottom. Men in his position didn't take on new problems. They survived. They kept their heads down. They made it to next week. But Jacob's hand moved without permission, pulling the flyer from the glass. The mare's auction number, Lot 47, was stamped in smudged ink across her chest. Approximately 8 years old. Temperament unknown. Starting bid $50 with the unspoken ending that everyone in ranch country knew. If nobody bid, the kill buyers would. Slaughter paid by the pound, and even a lame horse had value to someone who saw animals as meat instead of miracles. He folded the flyer carefully, creasing it along lines that already existed, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. The paper settled against his chest, right above his heart, light as a feather and heavy as a promise he hadn't yet made. Outside, the desert had gone dark, the kind of complete darkness that only exists far from cities, where the stars emerge like pinpricks in black cloth and the silence is so total you can hear your own blood moving. Jacob loaded the oat bag into the bed of his ancient truck, a vehicle held together by rust and stubbornness in equal measure. He sat in the driver's seat but didn't turn the key. Instead, he stared at the dashboard, at the photograph of Sophie he'd taped there, her gap-toothed smile from 3 years ago when she still looked at him like he hung the moon. He thought about that mare, about the way she'd turned her face from the camera, and wondered if shame looked the same on animals as it did on men. The auction was tomorrow morning. 20 miles north, in a dirt lot behind the county fairgrounds where dreams went to die and desperate people made choices they'd spend years justifying. Jacob had $8 and a conscience that wouldn't let him sleep. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. He pulled the flyer from his pocket one more time, studying that defiant, broken creature in the failing dome light. Maybe kindness was just another form of suicide. Or maybe, just maybe, saving something else was the only way left to save yourself. The auction grounds emerged from dawn mist like a fever dream, portable steel corrals arranged in crooked rows, diesel generators coughing exhaust into air cold enough to crystallize breath, and everywhere the smell of frightened animals and human desperation mixing into something acrid and unforgettable. Jacob arrived as the sun broke over the Stillwater Range, painting the metal fencing in shades of copper and ash. His $8 were folded in his front pocket, creased so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. The crowd gathered in clusters, wealthy hobbyists in spotless Carhartt jackets still creased from the package, professional trainers with calculating eyes and clipboards, and at the edges, the kill buyers. You could always identify them by their silence, the way they stood apart and watched without pretense. They weren't here for redemption or rescue. They were here for weight and meat prices, and they always went home with trailers full. Jacob positioned himself near the back fence, away from the clusters of conversation, his shoulders hunched against the morning cold. The auctioneer's voice crackled through a failing PA system, announcing lots with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned not to see the animals as anything more than inventory. Numbers, ages, defects. Lot after lot moved through the ring, young horses that bucked and fought, older ones that had given up, their eyes already emptied of everything that made them worth saving. Then came Lot 47. The buckskin mare limped into the auction ring with her head low, each step on her front left leg a visible struggle. Her coat, which should have gleamed gold in the morning light, hung dull and lifeless, stretched over ribs you could count from 30 feet away. But it was her eyes that stopped Jacob's breath, dark, intelligent, blazing with something that wasn't fear. It was rage. Pure, undiluted fury at the injustice of her circumstances, at the pain radiating through damaged bone, at the men who stood in judgment deciding her worth. Lot 47, the auctioneer's voice flattened into pure bureaucracy. Buckskin mare, approximately 8 years old, lame front left, temperament unknown. Captured from the stone cabin wild herd. Starting bid $50. Silence answered him. The kind of silence that has weight and texture, that presses against your eardrums like deep water. The hobbyists looked away, suddenly fascinated by their phones. The trainers made notes and shook their heads. The kill buyers waited with the patience of vultures, knowing the price would fall. 45. The auctioneer's voice carried a note of resignation. Come on folks. $40 for a registered Mustang? The mare circled the pen, her limp growing more pronounced with each rotation. She didn't panic or rear. She simply moved, as if motion itself was the last dignity available to her. Jacob watched her favor that leg, saw the muscle tremor with each reluctant step, and recognized the specific mathematics of survival, the way you keep going even when every fiber of your body screams to stop, because stopping means surrender, and surrender means death. $25. The auctioneer was losing interest, already glancing at his roster for the next lot. 20? Folks, I can't give her away. $15. Do I hear 15? Nothing. The mare paused at the far end of the ring, her sides heaving, and for one impossible moment her eyes found Jacob's through the crowd in the distance. He felt that gaze like a physical touch, like recognition passing between two beings who understood what it meant to be judged worthless by a world that had no patience for broken things. $10, the auctioneer said flatly. $10 going once. 8, Jacob heard himself say. His voice cracked the silence like a stone through glass. Heads turned. Someone laughed, a short bark of disbelief. The auctioneer squinted against the rising sun, trying to locate the voice in the back shadows. Sir, did you say $8? Yes. Jacob stepped forward, his legs moving independent of conscious thought. $8. The laughter spread, rippling through the crowd with the cruel efficiency of mockery. A woman in designer boots whispered something to her companion. One of the kill buyers shook his head slowly, as if witnessing something simultaneously pathetic and inevitable. The auctioneer looked genuinely sad for a moment, his professional mask slipping to reveal the tired man beneath. $8 going once. He raised his gavel without hope. Going twice. No counterbid came. Even the kill buyers knew a lame horse cost more in feed and transport than the slaughterhouse would pay. In the terrible algebra of their business, This mare was already a loss. The gavel fell with a sound like a bone breaking. Sold to bidder 127 for $8. Jacob's hands shook as he signed the paperwork, his signature barely legible across forms he didn't bother reading. The clerk took his $8 with an expression caught between pity and contempt, stamped the transfer papers, and told him to collect his purchase from holding pen 3. Someone muttered, "Damn fool," as he walked past. Jacob didn't disagree. The mare stood in the corner of the pen when he arrived, her weight shifted entirely off the damaged leg. Up close, she was worse than he'd imagined. Open sores along her withers, hooves cracked and overgrown, every bone visible beneath hide that had forgotten what regular meals meant. But when he approached with the lead rope, speaking in the low, steady voice he'd once used with his daughter during nightmares, she didn't fight. She simply looked at him with those burning eyes and seemed to ask a question Jacob recognized because he'd been asking it himself for 3 years. "Do you see me? Not what I've become, but what I am beneath this brokenness." "I see you," he whispered. The mare followed him into the trailer with the exhausted compliance of someone who'd run out of strength to resist fate. Jacob secured the gate, his hands still trembling, and realized he'd just traded his last $8 for a creature everyone else had deemed worthless. He had no plan, no resources, no idea how to fix a shattered leg or mend whatever other damage lived beneath that dull coat. But as he climbed into his truck and heard the mare shift her weight in the trailer behind him, settling in with a sigh that sounded almost like relief, Jacob understood something profound. Sometimes salvation isn't a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just two broken things recognizing each other in a crowd of people too busy calculating value to see worth. He pulled onto the highway as the sun cleared the mountains, driving toward an uncertain future with $8 less and everything that mattered more. Dr. Sarah Chin arrived 3 days later in a truck that had seen better decades, her veterinary kit rattling in the passenger seat like bones in a box. She was Jacob's age, maybe younger, with calloused hands that suggested she'd worked her way through school doing the kind of ranch labor that built character and destroyed romanticism. She'd come as a favor to Mrs. Alvarez, who'd called in worry after seeing the skeletal mare Jacob had brought home. "You named her Ember?" Sarah said, not quite a question. She stood at the corral fence, studying the buckskin with the clinical detachment of someone trained to assess damage without flinching. "For something almost out," Jacob replied. "But not quite." Sarah ducked through the rails with practiced efficiency, approaching the mare with slow, deliberate movements. Ember stood rigid, every muscle tensed for flight or fight, but the damaged leg made both options theoretical. Jacob had spent 72 hours hand-walking her in 20-minute intervals, cold-hosing the swollen joint, offering grain she barely touched. The mare watched him constantly now, her eyes tracking his movements with an intensity that felt like surveillance and prayer combined. "Talk to me about prognosis," Jacob said, hating how his voice revealed hope he couldn't afford. Sarah ran her hands down Ember's foreleg with the gentle precision of someone reading Braille. The mare flinched but held still, trembling under the examination. Minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by Ember's anxious breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling thermals above the desert. When Sarah finally stood, her expression carried the specific gravity of bad news delivered by good people. "There's an old fracture here," she said quietly. "Poorly healed, probably 3 years old. The bone set wrong and now there's significant arthritis developing. Jacob, I need to be honest, this mare might never be sound for riding. You should consider humane euthanasia before you invest more resources you don't have." The words landed like blows, each one precisely aimed at the hope Jacob had been cultivating in the dark hours when he couldn't sleep. He opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah had gone still, her fingers tracing something along Ember's shoulder beneath the matted coat. "Wait," she breathed. "Hold her steady." Sarah pulled a small brush from her kit and worked at the accumulated grime with focused intensity, revealing skin beneath the dirt. Jacob watched her face transform from clinical assessment to sharp curiosity. She brushed harder, clearing a patch about 4 inches square, and suddenly they were both staring at something that changed everything. A brand. Not the simple geometric mark of Bureau of Land Management ownership, but an elegant, professional symbol, a stylized crown above intertwined letters. MRF. "That's not BLM," Sarah said slowly. She pulled out her phone, photographed the brand from multiple angles, her movements quick and urgent. "That's a private breeder mark. An expensive one." "What does that mean?" "It means this mare wasn't born wild." Sarah's voice had shifted into investigative mode, her veterinarian's objectivity giving way to something sharper. "Someone owned her before. Someone with money. I need to run this brand through the databases. Don't do anything until I call you." She left in a spray of gravel, promising 48 hours. Jacob spent them in peculiar limbo, continuing Ember's rehabilitation while watching the mare with new eyes. Who had she been before the desert claimed her? How does a branded, obviously valuable animal end up skeletal and broken in a BLM wild horse roundup? Sarah returned on a Tuesday afternoon with a manila folder thick enough to suggest either answers or more elaborate questions. Her face told Jacob which one before she opened her mouth. Her registered name is Ember's Golden Dynasty, Sarah said, spreading documents across the hood of Jacob's truck like evidence at a crime scene. She belongs to Monarch Ridge Farms, one of the most elite breeding operations in North America. Her bloodline traces back to 3 Triple Crown winners. Conservative breeding value, $2.8 million. The numbers made no sense in the context of the skeletal mare standing in the corral behind them. Jacob stared at the papers, pedigree charts, breeding records, glossy photographs of a younger, healthier Ember posed with blue ribbons and silver trophies. In those images, her coat gleamed like molten gold, her legs stood square and sound, her eyes held the confidence of an animal that knew her worth. She was reported stolen 3 years ago, Sarah continued. Transport truck carrying 6 horses crashed on Highway 95 near the Oregon border. Driver killed instantly. 5 horses recovered within 48 hours. But Ember vanished. Search lasted a week before Monarch Ridge collected insurance and moved on. She must have run into BLM territory, survived somehow with that broken leg, and integrated with the wild herds. Jacob felt something cold and hard crystallizing in his chest. They stopped looking after a week? Insurance paid out at $3 million. Why keep searching? Sarah's voice carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. I did some digging into Monarch Ridge. They've had multiple animal welfare investigations, aggressive breeding practices, mares kept pregnant constantly until their bodies break down. Everything settled quietly with money and lawyers. If Ember goes back there. She didn't need to finish. They both understood what awaited a mare worth millions in breeding potential. Jacob's phone rang, the sound jarring in the desert silence. A known number. He answered with the wariness of someone who'd learned that unexpected calls rarely brought good news. Mr. Mercer? The voice was smooth, educated, carrying the specific confidence of inherited wealth. My name is Richard Vandermeer. I'm the CEO of Monarch Ridge Farms. I understand you're currently in possession of our property. Her name is Ember, Jacob said quietly. Her name is irrelevant. She's a registered asset with a clear chain of ownership. I'm prepared to offer you $500 as a finder's fee, plus reimbursement for any feed costs. I'll send transport tomorrow to collect her. Jacob looked at Ember, who stood in the late afternoon light with her head finally raised, watching him with those intelligent, furious eyes. He thought about the crashed truck, the week-long search that ended when insurance paid, the 3 years she'd survived alone with a shattered leg in country that killed strong horses. He thought about breeding operations that saw animals as inventory, about the specific cruelty of reducing a living creature to a balance sheet. No, Jacob said. The silence on the other end stretched for 3 heartbeats. When Vandermeer spoke again, the smoothness had evaporated, revealing something cold and sharp beneath. I'm giving you 48 hours to reconsider, Mr. Mercer. After that, my lawyers will make this decision for you. I suggest you think carefully about whether $8 was worth losing everything. The line went dead. Jacob stood holding his phone in the gathering dusk, staring at a mare worth millions that someone had abandoned to die, and understood with perfect clarity that the fight hadn't started at the auction. It had started 3 years ago on a crashed highway, and it was about to become his. The lawsuit arrived by certified mail on a Thursday morning, 47 pages of legal language that reduced Ember to item of property, estimated value $2,800,000, unlawfully detained. Jacob read it twice in the cab of his truck, his hands leaving sweat marks on the expensive paper, and understood he was facing an opponent with infinite resources against his absolute zero. The local news picked up the story within days. Ranch hand refuses to surrender $1 million horse. And suddenly Jacob's borrowed patch of desert became a carnival of opinion. Reporters called at dawn asking for statements. Strangers left comments on newspaper websites debating whether he was a hero or a thief. His ex-wife texted once, "Sophie saw the news. She's worried about you." It was more words than Caroline had sent him in 6 months. Maria Santos found him on a Sunday, arriving unannounced in a sedan held together by determination and student loans. She was 27, a public defender with idealism still intact and a briefcase full of case law about animal abandonment statutes. She'd read about Ember and driven 3 hours without being asked because, as she explained while standing in his makeshift corral, sometimes the law protects the wrong people and someone has to fix that. They had 11 days to prepare. The hearing took place in Churchill County Courthouse, a building that had witnessed a century of Nevada justice dispensed in varying degrees of fairness. Jacob wore his only dress shirt, the collar frayed but clean, and sat at the defendant's table feeling like an imposter in his own life. Maria arranged her modest stack of documents with the careful precision of someone who knew she was outgunned. Across the aisle, Richard Vandermeer commanded an army. 3 corporate attorneys in suits that cost more than Jacob's truck, leather briefcases embossed with law firm names that advertised their expense, and Vandermeer himself, silver-haired, commanding, wearing confidence like cologne. He glanced at Jacob once with the dismissive assessment of a man accustomed to obstacles that money eliminated. Judge Raymond Carstairs entered with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his youth on horseback before the law found him. He was 73, with hands scarred from ranch work and eyes that had seen enough courtroom theater to recognize genuine stakes from performance. Monarch Ridge's lead attorney opened with overwhelming force. Ownership papers traced through 20 years of breeding records, insurance documentation proving the mare's value, police reports from the transport accident, and expert testimony establishing clear chain of title. Their case was a fortress built from paperwork and precedent, each document another brick in a wall designed to be impenetrable. Your Honor, the attorney concluded with practiced gravitas, this is not a complex case. The defendant possesses property that legally belongs to my client. We request immediate return and compensation for 3 years of lost breeding revenue, estimated conservatively at $400,000. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Jacob felt his stomach drop, calculating impossible mathematics, $400,000 against his $8 in borrowed land. Maria stood, and Jacob noticed her hands weren't shaking. Your Honor, I'd like to call Dr. Sarah Chin. Sarah took the stand in her work clothes, smelling faintly of antiseptic and horses, and told the truth without embellishment. She described Ember's injuries in clinical detail, the improperly healed fracture, the muscle atrophy, the evidence of prolonged starvation. She presented photographs documenting the mare's condition at auction. Every visible rib, the open sores, the leg swollen to twice its normal size. Dr. Chin, Maria asked quietly, in your professional opinion, when did this fracture occur? Approximately 3 years ago, based on bone calcification patterns. Consistent with the timeline of the transport accident. And was this injury ever properly treated? No. If it had been, the bone would have healed straight. This mare received no veterinary care whatsoever. Maria introduced the abandonment statute, Nevada law stating that livestock left without adequate care for more than 90 days could be considered forsaken property. She presented Jacob's receipts, every dollar spent on feed, veterinary care, rehabilitation. She showed the timeline, Monarch Ridge's search lasting exactly 8 days before insurance paid out, 3 years of silence, sudden interest only after someone else had done the saving. They didn't want this mare, Maria said, her voice rising with controlled passion. They wanted the insurance money. Mr. Mercer found a dying animal everyone else had given up on, spent resources he didn't have, and brought her back to health. The law recognizes adverse possession, the principle that abandoned property restored through labor and care transfers to the one who refused to abandon it. Vandermeer's attorney objected with the efficiency of expensive training, but Judge Carstairs raised a weathered hand. I'd like to ask Mr. Vandermeer a question directly. The judge's voice carried the particular authority of someone whose respect must be earned, not purchased. Sir, your company collected $3 million in insurance for this animal. You ceased all search efforts after 8 days. Why should I return her to you now? Vandermeer stood, his composure absolute. Your Honor, with respect, legal ownership is not contingent on sentiment. The mare is registered property. The law is clear. The law, Judge Carstairs said slowly, is also clear about abandonment and unjust enrichment. You can't collect insurance for a dead horse and then reclaim her when someone else refuses to let her die. The courtroom held its breath. The judge reviewed documents in silence that stretched like wire under tension. Finally, he looked up, and Jacob saw something in those old ranchers' eyes that might have been recognition. One man who'd saved broken things seeing another who'd tried. Ownership transfers to Jacob Mercer. Monarch Ridge will refund their insurance payout to the carrier and reimburse Mr. Mercer's documented expenses. This court will not reward abandonment with profit. The gavel fell like thunder. 6 months later, Jacob stood in the early morning light watching his daughter brush Ember's gleaming coat, the mare standing patient and sound, her leg healed enough for gentle riding. Sophie was 13 now, visiting every weekend, and when she looked at her father, Jacob saw something he'd lost 3 years ago, respect earned through quiet perseverance. His phone buzzed. A text from a stranger. Saw your story. Have a horse nobody wants. Can you help? Jacob looked at the small rescue operation he'd built from $8 and one impossible choice. 3 more forgotten horses now grazing peacefully in expanded pastures. He typed back, "Send me the details." Ember nickered softly and Sophie laughed, the sound carrying across the desert like a bell. Jacob realized he'd stopped counting what he'd lost and started measuring what he'd built. One broken mare, one restored relationship, one small corner of the world where worthless things were given the chance to prove everyone wrong. He never knew if desperation or destiny brought Ember into that auction ring, but the mathematics had become beautifully simple. Sometimes $8 and a stubborn heart are worth more than millions in a world that's forgotten how to see value in the broken. Sometimes saving something else is exactly how you save yourself. If this story touched your heart, share it below. And remember, the most valuable things are often the ones everyone else calls worthless, until someone looks close enough to see their worth.